kept everything going. And that is the remarkable thing about this. It always produces the best in everybody in so many ways.
It was not announced with trumpets. It was not wrapped in ceremony. It arrived like a quiet sentence that changed everything. The breaking of the morning. The first thing that felt wrong was the silence, not the peaceful kind that comes with early winter mornings in London, but the kind that tightens the chest without explanation. In the private corridors of Buckingham Palace, the usual soft rhythms of staff movement had slowed to a near standstill. Doors that normally whispered open were being held in place. Footsteps that once followed steady patterns now hesitated at every intersection. Somewhere deep inside the building, a clock chimed the hour with a sound that lingered too long in the air. Outside, the city was only just waking. A thin frost hugged the pavement. The sky had not yet decided if it would be gray or pale blue. Reporters were already gathering, sensing something before they knew what it was. No schedule had been released, no formal notice had been issued. Yet instinct told them that something had shifted during the night. The crowd formed quietly, voices low, as if even speculation felt inappropriate in the cold. Inside the palace, King Charles sat at a narrow desk near the window, his hands folded together in front of him. The papers laid out before him were perfectly aligned, untouched since being placed there. He had read them already, twice. Each word had landed with a finality that no amount of rewriting could soften. Across from him stood Prince William, rigid in posture but hollow in the eyes. The shared silence between them was not political. It was personal. Nothing in Charles's long preparation for the crown had trained him for moments like this. He had weathered scandals, constitutional strain, public fury, and private family fractures. Yet this was different. This carried no strategy, no defense, no narrative escape. This was the kind of news that did not bend to institution or tradition. It simply arrived, and everything after it had to be rebuilt around the damage. William had not slept. That much was obvious to anyone who looked twice. His jaw was tight, his shoulders held too high, as if his body had not yet learned how to stand under the weight of what he was carrying. He had arrived before dawn without announcement, bypassing the outer offices entirely. No one stopped him. No one would have dared. The look on his face had already answered every question. No words were exchanged at first. They did not need to be. The confirmation had already been delivered hours earlier behind doors even more private than this one. Physicians had spoken in cautious terms that still left no room for misunderstanding. Advisors had waited on the edges of the room like shadows that did not belong. When the room finally cleared, only two men remained: a father and a grandfather, a future king and a sitting one, bound not by crown, but by the same unbearable realization. At precisely 6 minutes past 7 in the morning, the decision was made, not debated, not negotiated, simply acknowledged. The confirmation would go out, not later in the day, not after careful staging. It would go out as soon as language could be shaped that did not betray the truth and did not break what remained of the family's privacy. This was not a scandal to contain. This was a reality to honor. The palace communications office was activated without the usual cascade of instructions. There were no rehearsed steps for this, only the legal requirements of announcement and the moral obligation of restraint. Drafts moved quietly from desk to desk. Words were weighed with unusual reverence. Every sentence felt like it carried more than information. It carried consequence. Beyond the formal rooms, the ripple began. Staff members noticed first in the smallest ways. A senior aide who paused mid-corridor and closed her eyes. A security officer who stepped aside to answer a call and did not return for several minutes. A household manager who abruptly dismissed a routine briefing without explanation. In institutions like this, disruption rarely announces itself loudly. It leaks through behavior. By the time the first notification reached the outer press office, the sun had started to lift above the rooftops. The pale winter light slid across the gates where cameras now fully lined the street. No one yet knew what they were waiting for, only that something had broken the rhythm of the day before it had even begun. Inside a private residence elsewhere on the grounds, Catherine remained out of sight. Her presence was known only through the quiet movement of staff and the closed doors that no one approached without instruction. The household had shifted into a mode that had nothing to do with protocol and everything to do with protection. William had not seen her since before dawn, not because distance had grown between them, but because some moments demand solitude before they can bear witnesses. When the final version of the confirmation reached King Charles for approval, he did not correct a single word. He only held the paper for several moments longer than necessary. Then he nodded once. The gesture was small, final. The kind of motion that ends a chapter whether one is ready for it to end or not. The public would soon learn that something tragic had been confirmed. They would analyze tone, timing, wording. They would search for clues in what was said and what was not. But in that quiet room, none of that mattered. What mattered was that Prince Louis, the youngest thread in the future of the crown, now stood at the center of a moment that no one had ever wanted written into history. And when the doors finally opened that morning, it was not ceremony that stepped into the corridor first. It was the sound of grief struggling to move inside walls that had been built for power. What the public was never meant to see. Long before the morning that would fracture the household, before the cameras gathered and before a single word was sanctioned for release, there had been quiet alterations to the daily rhythms inside the Wales family. Nothing dramatic at first. Small changes that would have meant nothing to the outside world. A school pickup quietly reassigned, a schedule shortened without explanation, a set of appearances removed from the public calendar with language so neutral it almost disappeared into the page. Prince Louis had always been the most kinetic presence in the household. Where his siblings moved with measured awareness of the world watching them, Louis moved with instinct unfiltered by expectation. Staff often described him as wind inside walls built for order. That was what made the first signs so unsettling. He grew quieter, not withdrawn in a way that drew alarm immediately, but subdued enough to register only in hindsight. By the time anyone began to ask questions, the pattern had already established itself. Catherine was the first to notice that something was not aligning. Mothers always are. What others interpreted as fatigue from routine, she felt as something heavier beneath the surface. There were mornings when Louis lingered longer than usual at the breakfast table, his usual restlessness replaced by stillness that did not belong to him. There were afternoons when his energy faded too early, as if he had already run through a day that had barely begun. And there were moments when his laughter arrived on time, but left too quickly. William tried to rationalize it at first. Children falter, seasons change, growth is uneven, yet somewhere deep beneath his reasoning, an unease began to settle that would not be dismissed. He found himself watching more closely, listening with greater attention, measuring the space between who his son had been and who he appeared to be becoming. And in that narrowing space between instinct and avoidance, his certainty began to thin. The first consultation was arranged quietly and without ceremony. No announcement, no formal transport, no public physician. The vehicle left from a side gate before sunrise and returned before the household had fully stirred. The language used afterward was deliberately vague. Routine checks, precautionary visits. Reassurance was offered even where none had been asked for. But reassurance that arrives unprompted often reveals the very fear it is meant to conceal. As weeks passed, the rhythm inside the family continued to shift. George noticed before anyone realized he had. Children always do. He asked questions that no one answered directly. He watched his parents more than usual. Charlotte became gentler in ways that did not match her age. The household had entered a season of quiet adaptation without ever naming what it was adapting to. It was not denial, it was protection. Language has a way of solidifying fears that some families are not yet ready to speak. Outside the palace walls, nothing appeared unusual. Catherine remained out of public view under explanations that everyone had already learned to accept without scrutiny. William maintained appearances with discipline that only those closest to him could see through. The institution was functioning as designed: contain, maintain, proceed. It had always been good at that. What it had never been good at was making space for vulnerability without turning it into spectacle. The second medical consultation did not happen in secret. It happened in silence, not the kind that avoids attention, but the kind that accepts it no longer matters. The specialists were brought in through controlled routes, known only to senior aides. The meetings were longer, the language afterward more careful. No one spoke the word that hovered in every corridor, not out of superstition, but out of reverence for how fragile truth can feel before it is fully understood. Somewhere in that stretch of days, the tone inside the residence shifted from uncertainty to preparation. Rooms were rearranged. Schedules were softened. Security arrangements expanded not outward but inward, focused on privacy rather than exposure. When a child becomes the axis around which every decision turns, the world does not rearrange itself loudly. It does so with quiet compliance. William canceled 2 engagements without offering justification. One of his closest advisors broke the unspoken rule and asked him directly if something was wrong. William did not answer immediately. When he finally did, it was not with information but with boundary. Not yet. That was all he said. It was enough to end the conversation and begin a weight that advisor would carry without ever knowing its full shape. By the time the third consultation occurred, the family no longer pretended it was routine. The physician spoke with a clarity that did not soften with kindness. Possibilities narrowed. Options were discussed with the careful phrasing that attempts to hold hope in one hand while acknowledging reality in the other. William listened without interruption. Catherine did not leave the room. What was said there would never be shared in full. It belonged only to the 3 of them and to the child at the center of every sentence. After that day, nothing truly returned to its previous form. The household moved forward because motion is what institutions and parents alike are trained to do. But the internal compass had shifted. Days were measured differently now. Time was no longer counted by events and obligations. It was counted by moments, by small victories, by unspoken fears that gathered quietly at night. The public saw none of this. They saw unchanged architecture, steady tradition, the appearance of continuity. They did not see the way Catherine would pause outside a closed door longer than necessary. They did not see the way William would remain seated after a meeting long after everyone else had left. They did not see how the youngest heartbeat inside the royal orbit had become the most fragile one. And by the time the morning of confirmation arrived, what the world believed to be sudden had already been living quietly inside the walls for far longer than anyone could have imagined. The decision-making room. The room chosen for the meeting was not one of the grand state chambers. There were no portraits watching from gold-framed walls, no long ceremonial table built for diplomacy. This room was smaller, quieter, designed for conversations that were never meant to echo beyond their occupants. The curtains were drawn against the pale winter light, not to hide what would be said, but to contain it. Within those walls, nothing about rank or pageantry mattered, only truth did. King Charles arrived first. He was already seated when the others entered, hands folded loosely in his lap, eyes fixed not on the door, but on a single point of shadow along the far wall. He had been given preliminary updates in stages over the preceding days. Carefully measured phrases, conditional language, probable outcomes. But this morning would be different. This morning would remove the last remaining distance between uncertainty and knowing. Prince William entered without escort. No advisor followed him inside. No aide closed the door on his behalf. He did it himself, with a control so deliberate it bordered on fragile. He took the seat closest to the physicians, not across from them, not in opposition, but beside the truth he already felt pressing against his chest. Catherine was not present. This was not because she was excluded. It was because she had already heard enough to know that this room would change them all. The lead physician spoke first. His voice was calm, not cold, not emotional. Calm in the way that only those who have delivered unbearable news many times can manage. He did not begin with comfort. He did not begin with apology. He began with clarity. Tests had confirmed what had until now remained suspended in possibility. The condition was real. It was not transient. It would progress. Charles closed his eyes for a brief moment. Not long enough for anyone to see it as collapse, only long enough to absorb what royalty does not protect anyone from hearing. When his eyes reopened, they carried no performance, only the quiet devastation of a man who had lived long enough to recognize the sound of life dividing itself into before and after. The physician continued. Options were reviewed, each one measured in weeks and months, not decades. The language remained precise, clinical. Yet underneath every sentence ran the unspoken certainty that the future now belonged not to ambition, but to survival. William did not interrupt. He asked no questions at first. His hands remained steady on his knees, but his breathing had changed. Slower, more deliberate, as if he were rationing air against something rising inside him. When he finally spoke, it was not as a prince. It was as a father. He asked how much time. The room did not respond immediately. Silence settled again, not from avoidance, but from the weight of the truth reshaping itself into words that could be borne. When the answer came, it did not carry exact numbers. It carried ranges. It carried uncertainty framed inside probability. It carried enough truth to remove illusion while leaving room for grace. King Charles asked one question only, not about treatment, not about prognosis. He asked if his grandson was in pain. The physician answered carefully, not now in the way that pain is often imagined. Not yet, but the road ahead would not be gentle. That answer landed harder than any numerical forecast. Charles nodded once. He had lived through illness enough to understand the sentence beneath the sentence. The meeting did not last long. There was nothing more to debate, no vote to be taken, no policy to be built. Decisions would come later about disclosure and timing and protection of privacy. But the core truth had been delivered. And once a truth like that enters a room, it never leaves with the people who exit. It stays. It alters the walls. When the physicians departed, they did so quietly. No reassurance was offered, not because there was none, but because reassurance belongs to those who live with consequences, not those who explain them. William remained seated long after the door had closed. Charles did not rise. The space between them had changed. They were no longer simply father and son navigating a crown. They were two men bound by the same fear of outliving a child they loved. William spoke first. His voice did not break. That was its own kind of breaking. He said they would protect Louis from becoming a public headline. He said there would be no speculation, no controlled leaks, no gradual conditioning of the press. He said when the time came, the truth would be spoken cleanly or not at all. Charles agreed without hesitation. The monarchy had survived by managing narrative, but this moment belonged to mercy, not optics. It was decided then that Catherine would not be forced into public appearance while the ground beneath her was still shifting. It was decided that George and Charlotte would be told in words chosen by their parents, not by protocol. It was decided that the weight of the institution would bend around the needs of a child, rather than the other way around, even if only for a season. When William finally stood, the room felt emptier than it had before the others arrived. Charles remained seated. There are moments when even kings are left without posture. He would later walk through halls lined with history and lineage and power, but he would do so carrying something none of them had ever prepared him for: the possible loss of the youngest future the crown still held. Outside the room, the palace continued its quiet operations. Messages were sent, appointments adjusted, routine preserved wherever possible, because that is what institutions do in the face of disruption. They proceed. But from the moment that door opened and closed again, no procession, no ceremony, no season of celebration would ever feel untouched by what had just been confirmed within those walls. And somewhere beyond those walls, unaware of the words that now governed every breath around him, Prince Louis continued his day inside a household that had just learned how fragile its future could be. The child at the center of the crown. Before the world ever learned his name as a headline, before the weight of consequence pressed itself into rooms built for power, Prince Louis had been known inside the household for something entirely different. He was motion, he was noise, he was the unpredictable spark in rooms shaped by routine. Where his siblings learned early the discipline of visibility, Louis learned joy without permission. He danced in corridors meant for formality. He laughed too loudly at moments when silence was expected. He reminded everyone, without intending to, that the monarchy still had room for childhood. Staff had always spoken about him differently, not with reverence, with affection. He asked questions that did not wait for answers. He noticed things others passed without thought. He once stopped an entire security procession because he wanted to show a guard a drawing he had made. The delay created a ripple of controlled panic that dissolved the moment the guard knelt down and accepted the paper with a smile. Moments like that lived in the quiet memory of the palace. Unrecorded, unmeasured, human. Catherine had often said that Louis felt the world first and understood it later. He did not approach life with caution. He approached it with commitment. When he ran fully. When he laughed, it filled rooms that had long ago learned to contain sound. When he cried, it was not rehearsed. It was pure. Even William, trained from childhood to measure his reactions against cameras and consequence, allowed himself to be unguarded around his youngest son in ways he never could. Elsewhere, in the earliest weeks of what would later be understood as decline, those bright edges softened. It was not dramatic. It was subtle enough that it could have been mistaken for ordinary fatigue. But Catherine noticed how he no longer surged through rooms with the same reckless confidence, how he paused before climbing stairs that he once sprinted up, how he leaned against her more often, not for attention, but for grounding. There were still days when he seemed unchanged, days when laughter returned in full force and the household exhaled in collective relief. On those days, hope felt not like denial, but like oxygen. The adults around him learned to live in those small mercies without interrogating them too closely. When a child smiles in the middle of fear, you take the smile. You do not ask it to justify itself. George began to sit closer to him, not instructed, not prompted, just drawn by instinct to protect what he could not yet name. Charlotte watched more quietly. She had always absorbed rooms in silence. Now her awareness sharpened. She learned before anyone taught her that something inside the family had shifted its balance. William struggled most in the spaces between public duty and private dread. At home, he was a father holding time as carefully as possible. In public, he was still the heir moving through engagements that continued regardless of who inside the palace needed him most. The separation was not only logistical, it was psychological. He learned to step out of grief at a doorway and step back into it hours later, as though switching between worlds that did not acknowledge one another. Catherine did not make that division. She remained inside the emotional center of the household, without constructing distance. She was present in every moment that allowed presence, at bedside, at meals, at quiet hours when no audience waited beyond the wall. If there is a language that mothers speak when words fail, she spoke it fluently, through touch, through stillness, through patience that never announced itself as strength. For Louis, the world continued as it always had, at least on the surface. Lessons still happened. Stories were still read aloud. Games were still played at a slower pace. No one told him yet what time would later explain on its own terms. Children understand more than they are told, but sometimes protection lies not in information, but in allowing innocence to complete its own season. There were moments when he asked questions that hung heavier in the air than they should have. Questions about why he felt tired, why he did not want to run the way he used to, why everyone watched him sometimes when they thought he was not looking. Those questions were answered gently, but not fully. Truth had not yet been given permission to arrive in complete form. In the evenings, when the lights dimmed and the palace quieted, Catherine often remained awake longer than necessary, not from fear alone, but from the awareness that these moments were being counted now in a way they never had been before. Each laugh, each story, each slow step toward sleep. Time had become something sacred and fragile instead of something promised. William sometimes stood outside the doorway and listened rather than enter, not because he wanted distance, but because he did not always trust himself with the sight. The idea of memorizing his son in the present felt like a betrayal of the belief that childhood should stretch forward endlessly. And yet some part of him already understood that memory was becoming as important as hope. Inside the institution, discussions continued about containment and preparation. But inside the family, none of that language mattered. What mattered was the child who still loved to press his forehead against the window, to watch the sky change in the evening. What mattered was the way he still reached for both parents at once when he was tired. What mattered was the way the household bent itself around his presence without ever announcing why. When history eventually looks back at this moment, it will speak in terms of succession and legacy and consequence. It will name structures and institutions and transformations. But those closest to the center of it will remember something far simpler and far heavier. They will remember a boy who once ran freely through halls built for kings. The confirmation that changed the House of Windsor. By the time the confirmation was prepared for release, the palace had already entered a different kind of silence. Not the anticipatory quiet of waiting for reaction, but the disciplined stillness that follows a decision no one can undo. The words had been chosen with surgical care. Nothing unnecessary. Nothing evasive. Every sentence shaped to carry truth without collapsing into spectacle. King Charles and Prince William would not speak separately. This would be a joint confirmation, a united front not of power, but of grief. The timing was deliberate, not early enough to appear rushed, not late enough to invite speculation. The release would come in the late morning, when both European and North American audiences could receive it simultaneously. The palace knew exactly how quickly the message would travel. What it did not know was how deeply it would sink. Some news moves across the world like weather. This would move like an earthquake, silent at first, then everywhere. Inside a smaller communications office near the private apartments, the final document was read aloud one last time. No edits were made. No legal challenges were raised. No strategic adjustments remained. Everyone in the room understood that once released, the language would become history, replayed and examined and carried into places none of them could control. Yet no one argued. The words were not perfect. They were simply honest. Catherine did not read the final version before it went out. That was a conscious choice, not from exclusion but from self-preservation. Some truths are easier to live with than to read. William did read it. He stood alone by a window while doing so. When he finished, he did not react outwardly. He only folded the paper once and placed it on a table as though it were something that deserved rest. When the confirmation was released, there was no build-up, no preview, no leading speculation. It appeared as a single clean transmission across official palace channels. The statement opened with acknowledgement, not apology. It confirmed that the King and the Prince of Wales were making the announcement together. It stated that Prince Louis had been facing a serious medical condition that had required ongoing care and protection. It confirmed that recent changes in the family schedule had been made in service of that reality. It ended with a request for privacy that did not beg for sympathy, but earned it through restraint. The response was immediate and global. Newsrooms shifted their programming within seconds. Anchors looked down at screens and then back up at cameras with expressions that betrayed the weight of what they had just read. Social media surged not into spectacle but into stillness of a different kind. The usual cycles of mockery and conspiracy stalled beneath the gravity of a child named directly in the language of fragility. Inside the palace, no one celebrated the speed of dissemination. They only observed it. Screens glowed silently in offices that had gone undisturbed for hours. Aides watched the numbers climb without comment. Staff members exchanged glances that carried recognition instead of strategy. This was not a moment to analyze impact. It was a moment to absorb consequence. William and Charles did not appear publicly that day. There were no photographs released, no recorded addresses. The institution did not attempt to frame the moment with image. It allowed the words to stand alone. That in itself was unprecedented. The monarchy had always understood the power of visibility. On this day, it chose absence. Catherine remained out of view. Her presence was felt only through the shifting movement of staff who moved with unusual care along corridors near her private rooms. Those closest to her understood that motherhood does not require witnesses during its most difficult hours. The world would come later. For now, only the family existed. Elsewhere within the royal household, reactions unfolded quietly. Camilla withdrew from scheduled meetings without explanation. Senior advisors canceled long-planned briefings as if the machinery of state itself had paused for breath. Even the guards at the gates moved differently, with a subtle gentleness that had nothing to do with protocol and everything to do with human response. Across the world, people who had never met the child felt connected to him through a rare shared vulnerability. Commentators did not debate. They measured their voices. There were no arguments about legacy or succession on that day, only reflections on innocence and uncertainty. The crown, for once, was not being considered as symbol. It was being seen as family. For William, the release did not bring relief. It brought exposure. The truth that had been held close now belonged to millions. That transition carried its own emotional cost. He understood the necessity of it. He had agreed to it. But agreement does not cancel sorrow. It only disciplines it. And when the initial surge of reaction passed and the world moved on to processing what it had been given, the family returned to the interior reality that no press release could alter. A child still waking each morning into uncertainty. Parents still learning how to carry strength without knowing how long it would be needed. A grandfather still sitting with the knowledge that titles do not protect against time. The confirmation had changed everything publicly, but privately, the transformation had already taken place long before the world ever heard a word. What comes after a silence like this? After the confirmation had traveled the world and settled into public consciousness, the palace did not return to normal. It adjusted around absence in a way that only institutions with long memory know how to do. Schedules resumed in modified form. Meetings returned with softened language. Plans continued under the quiet understanding that something irreversible now lived beneath every forward motion. For King Charles, the weight landed differently than it had before. His reign had already been shaped by narrowing margins of time. Illness had introduced its own reckoning into his stewardship of the crown. Now there was a new dimension to that awareness. The not knowing of what time would demand from his grandson sharpened every private moment he spent with the family. He did not wear this publicly. He carried it in the stillness between official duties, where kings are finally allowed to be grandfathers. For William, the transformation was deeper and more immediate. The line between future and present collapsed inward. He had always understood the crown as something waiting for him. Now he understood it as something that could never protect what mattered most. The shift was not dramatic. It was internal. A tightening of priorities, a narrowing of what truly deserved sacrifice. The ambition that had once shaped his long preparation began to give way to something quieter and more enduring. Catherine remained the unsung axis around which the household turned. Her strength did not announce itself. It manifested in repetition, in patience, in the unremarkable heroism of showing up again and again when certainty had withdrawn. She bore neither spectacle nor strategy, only presence. And sometimes, presence is the only form of power that can outlast despair. George and Charlotte carried their awareness differently. Children do not process tragedy in adult language. They absorb it through changes in atmosphere, through the way rooms grow quieter, through the way adults speak more softly. They did not need the full truth to understand that something had altered the gravity around them. Their roles as older siblings grew heavier in ways no one had prepared them for, yet within that weight, instinct guided them toward care. Prince Louis himself remained at the center of every unspoken calculation. Each decision bent around what he could bear. Each day was approached not as guarantee, but as gift. The family learned to live without assuming, to treasure without forecasting, to hope without demanding that hope justify itself through promises of permanence. Inside the wider institution, conversations began about continuity with new humility. Succession had always been discussed in terms of inevitability. Now it was approached with awareness of fragility. The mythology of certainty that once clung to the crown thinned under the touch of real human vulnerability. For the first time in a very long while, the monarchy did not feel untouchable. It felt mortal. Yet it did not fracture under that awareness. It recalibrated. There is a difference between collapse and transformation. Collapse erases. Transformation reshapes. The crown did not retreat from its duties. It learned to move differently while carrying grief within its structure. History has room for that kind of adjustment. It always has. Public attention gradually softened as attention always does. Outrage faded. Headlines thinned. News stories claimed their space on the endless scroll of time. But the family remained where it had always been since that first quiet shift months earlier. Inside the slow daily rhythm of uncertainty and care. Outside the reach of spectacle. Inside the permanence of love. Somewhere within those walls, a child still watched the sky change each evening. Still reached for both parents at once. Still laughed when his strength allowed. The world might one day measure this season in numbers and outcomes and legacy. But within the home, only moments mattered. And sometimes, moments are the only legacy that truly survives. There are stories that unfold loudly, and there are stories that unfold quietly. This is not a story of scandal or spectacle. It is a story of a family confronting the limits of power, the fragility of youth, and the truth that not even a crown can command time. Whatever comes next will not erase what has already been lived. The silence that arrived with this confirmation now lives inside Britain's oldest institution, not as weakness, but as reminder. A reminder that behind every title is a heartbeat, and behind every throne is a family that, like all others, walks forward without certainty into the unseen.